Montana Highlands. Winter of 1936. The question nobody asked was simple. What could Wool do that wood couldn't? In the high valleys west of Great Falls, where wind carved ice into the timber and froze breath mid-air, one man built something the others called foolish. A shepherd's cabin wrapped in fleece. Walls stuffed with what most folks burned or tossed aside after shearing season. They said it looked like a sheep died on his house. But when January 1937 hit with temperatures that hadn't been seen in 65 years, when the valley turned into a frozen hell and firewood became more precious than gold, that wool-covered shack became the warmest place for 50 miles. This is the story of how ignorance almost killed a community and how the simplest materials saved them. If you want to see a survival technique that still works today, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to learn could save your life one day. Let's go back to 1936. His name was Elias Morrow, 64 years old, weather hands, a face carved by wind and sun. He'd spent 40 years moving sheep through the Montana Highlands, from summer pasture to winter shelter, season after season, alone most of the time. By October 1936, Elias knew he had a problem. His cabin sat at the edge of a pine grove, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, built 20 years prior from lodgepole pine logs and river stone. It had served him well enough. A single room, maybe 12 by 14 feet. Stone hearth on the north wall. Wooden floor raised 6 inches off the ground. Shuttered windows facing south. But the gaps had grown. The chinking between the logs, moss and clay mixed with pine resin, had dried out, cracked, fallen away in places. Wind came through those cracks like knives. On cold mornings, he'd wake to frost on the inside walls. The fire he built each night would burn hot for an hour, maybe 2, then the cold would creep back in, settle into his bones, make his hands stiff. He needed more firewood. A lot more. The problem was simple. There wasn't enough. The summer had been dry. Forest fires to the west had taken thousands of acres. What timber remained was being claimed fast by every homesteader and rancher in the valley. Elias had maybe half the wood he needed to make it through winter. And winter in that country didn't ask permission. It arrived early, stayed late, and killed anything unprepared. He could buy wood, sure, but the cost had doubled. His savings from the wool sale barely covered flour and coffee. Spending it all on firewood meant no food. So he started thinking. Late September, after the fall shearing, Elias stood in his shed staring at 700 pounds of raw wool. Dirty, greasy, full of burrs and debris. The buyers had come through in August, paid pennies per pound for the clean fleece. What remained was the stuff nobody wanted, belly wool, leg wool, tags full of manure and mud. Worthless. Except it wasn't. Elias had spent enough time with sheep to know one thing. They didn't freeze. Even in the worst storms, even with ice caking their backs, sheep stayed warm. The wool kept them alive. It trapped air. It shed water. It insulated. What if he could do the same thing to his cabin? The idea came to him not as brilliance, but as desperation. He didn't have money. He didn't have time. But he had wool. Piles of it. And he had a cabin with gaps that bled heat faster than he could make it. By early October, he'd made his decision. He'd lined the inside walls with raw wool. Not pretty, not conventional, but practical. He started by removing the inner planks on the east wall, rough sawn boards he'd nailed up years ago to keep the wind out. Behind them, the log wall stood bare, gaps visible between each timber. He stuffed handfuls of wool into every crack, packing it tight with a stick, filling the voids until no light showed through. Then he built a second wall. Using scrap lumber and old fence boards, he framed a new interior wall 6 inches in front of the logs. Between that frame and the logs, he packed more wool. Layers of it. Thick, dense, compressed. He worked section by section, stuffing the cavity full, then nailing the boards over it to hold everything in place. It took him 3 weeks. When he finished, the walls were fat. The cabin had shrunk inside by nearly a foot on each side, but it felt different. Quieter. The wind that used to whistle through the cracks had gone silent. Even before he lit the fire, the air inside seemed softer, less sharp. He stepped outside to look at his work. It didn't look like a cabin anymore. It looked like a mistake. Elias Moro's modification was crude, but it followed a principle most builders in 1936 didn't think about. Trapped air is the best insulator. Here's what he did, step by step. First, he assessed the existing structure. His cabin was built from 8-inch lodgepole pine logs, stacked horizontally with saddle notch corners. The gaps between logs, where the chinking had failed, ranged from 1/4 inch to over an inch in places. Those gaps were bleed points. Every bit of heat generated by the fire escaped through them, pulled out by wind and convection. Second, he removed the inner wall boards. These were vertical planks nailed to the inside face of the logs, creating a smooth interior surface. Taking them down exposed the full log wall and all its gaps. Third, he stuffed raw wool into every crack. He used the belly wool first, short, dense, full of lanolin. Lanolin is a natural grease that sheep produce to waterproof their fleece. It made the wool slightly water-resistant and helped it compress without crumbling. He packed it tight using a wooden dowel, forcing it deep into the gaps until the cracks were sealed. Fourth, he built a new interior frame. Using 2x4 boards salvaged from an old hay shed, he constructed a stud wall 6 inches inside the original log wall. This created a cavity, a 6-inch gap between the logs and the new inner surface. Fifth, he filled that cavity with wool. Not loosely. He compressed it, layer by layer, tamping it down with a flat board to eliminate air pockets while still maintaining the wool's loft. Loft is what gives wool its insulating power. Each fiber has a crimped, wavy structure that traps tiny pockets of air. Those pockets slow down heat transfer. Sixth, he covered the frame with planks, sealing the wool inside. The result was a wall system with 3 layers. The original log wall on the outside, 6 inches of compressed wool in the middle, and a new plank wall on the inside. He repeated this process on all 4 walls. The floor was next. Elias' new cold air sank, and his cabin sat on 6-inch stone piers with nothing but open space underneath. Wind blew through that crawl space, chilling the floor from below. He pulled up the floorboards, laid down a bed of loose wool, then replaced the boards. It wasn't airtight, but it cut the draft. The ceiling was last. He had no attic, just the underside of the roof boards and shingles. He spread a thick layer of wool across the top of the ceiling boards, tamping it down into every gap between the rafters. Wool doesn't burn easily. It chars and smolders but doesn't flame, so the fire risk was minimal. When he was finished, the cabin's interior dimensions had shrunk. The walls were thicker, the ceiling was lower, but the thermal performance had changed completely. Wool works because it's made of keratin fibers covered in microscopic scales. Those scales trap air and resist moisture. Even when damp, wool retains about 80% of its insulating value, unlike cotton or straw, which collapse and lose effectiveness when wet. The lanolin coating also repels water, preventing the wool from soaking through during snowmelt or condensation. Elias didn't know the science. He just knew sheep didn't freeze. From the outside, the cabin looked the same: log walls, stone chimney, shake roof. But from the inside, it had become something else: a thermal barrier, a heat trap, the kind of shelter that could hold warmth for hours after the fire died. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done, mostly because he knew what they'd say. Word got around fast. By mid-October, Elias had made a trip into town for supplies. He'd mentioned the wool walls to the man at the lumber yard, casually, just explaining why he didn't need as much firewood as usual. The man had laughed. "You stuff sheep wool in your walls?" Elias nodded. "About 6 inches worth." The man shook his head, grinning. "That's going to rot by spring. You know that, right? Wool holds moisture. It'll mildew, stink, fall apart. You'll have mice living in there by Christmas." Elias didn't argue. He paid for his nails and left. But the story spread. By the end of the week, half the valley knew about the old shepherd who'd turned his cabin into a sheep's back. The reaction was predictable: laughter, head shaking, a few comments about old men losing their sense. At the general store, a carpenter named Raymond Hess, a man who'd built half the barns in the county, heard the story and made his opinion clear. "Wool ain't a building material," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "It's what you wear, not what you build with." Moro's going to wake up with mold growing on his walls and rats nesting in his insulation. That cabin will be unlivable by February. Someone asked if we could even insulate. Hess snorted. Maybe if you're sheep. For a house? No. You need air gaps, proper chinking, seasoned wood. Not garbage from shearing shed. The comments weren't vicious. They were dismissive. The kind of thing people say when they see someone doing something strange and assume it's foolish because it's unfamiliar. A few folks were kinder. Elias's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Jack Torrance, stopped by one afternoon to see the work for himself. He walked around the cabin, looked at the walls, asked a few questions. "Does it work?" Jack asked. "Seems to," Elias said. "Fire stays warm longer. Cabin don't cool off as fast." Jack nodded slowly. "Huh. Well, good luck with it." That was as close to approval as Elias got. Most people just thought he was being cheap, or eccentric, or both. One woman at the church social said it looked like his cabin had grown fur. Another man joked that Elias was trying to turn into a sheep himself, since he spent so much time with them. Elias didn't respond to any of it. He'd spent 4 decades in the mountains, alone more often than not, and he'd learned a long time ago that other people's opinions didn't keep you warm. Results did. So he went back to his cabin, stacked his firewood, and waited for winter. He didn't have to wait long. January 1937. The cold came down from Canada like a hammer. By the second week of the month, temperatures across Montana had dropped to levels no one alive could remember. The weather stations in Great Falls recorded minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit. In the highlands, where Elias lived, it was colder. Probably minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe worse. It wasn't just cold. It was sustained cold. The temperature didn't rise above zero for 16 straight days. The kind of cold that froze sap inside trees and made them explode in the night. The kind that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your mouth. The kind that killed livestock in their stalls and froze water buckets solid in under an hour. The wind made it worse. Arctic air poured down from the north, unimpeded by mountains or forests. It swept across the valley floor, howling through every gap, every crack, every poorly sealed door. Wind chill drove the effective temperature down to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare hands. Elias's neighbors began to struggle. Jack Torrance, the rancher a few miles east, was burning through his firewood faster than he'd planned. His cabin, built well but conventionally, bled heat. He kept the fire roaring day and night, feeding it split pine every 2 hours, but the inside temperature barely stayed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. His family wore coats indoors. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, thick enough to block the light. Another family, the Caldwells, ran out of dry wood by the 10th day. The green timber they'd cut in desperation wouldn't burn hot. It hissed and smoked and gave off almost no heat. Their youngest child developed frostbite on her toes, even inside the house. The old trapper who lived up the ridge, a man named Silas Kern, stopped by Jack's place on the 14th day. He looked exhausted. His hands were shaking. He said his cabin was burning 4 cords of wood a week and still couldn't hold warmth past midnight. "I don't know if I'm going to make it," Silas said quietly. Jack gave him some of his own firewood. It was all he could do. Meanwhile, 3 miles west, Elias Moro sat in his wool-lined cabin calm. The fire in his hearth was smaller than usual. Not roaring, just steady. A bed of coals with a few split logs, glowing orange. He fed it once every 4 hours, sometimes longer if he let it burn down overnight. The inside temperature held at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Even when the fire reduced to embers, the cabin stayed livable. The walls, packed with wool, absorbed the radiant heat from the hearth and released it slowly back into the room. The floor stayed warm. The air didn't bite. Frost didn't form on the inside walls. Elias wore a wool shirt and a vest, not a heavy coat. He slept under 2 blankets instead of 4. His hands didn't ache when he woke up. The water bucket by the door stayed liquid. On the 15th day, Jack Torrance came by. He'd ridden over on horseback, bundled in layers, face wrapped in a scarf. He knocked on Elias's door and stepped inside when it opened. The warmth hit him like a wall. Jack stood there, blinking, his breath fogging in the doorway. He looked around the cabin, at the fire, at the walls, at Elias sitting calmly in a chair by the hearth. "Ow!" Jack asked. Elias smiled. "Wool." Jack didn't laugh this time. "Stay with me, because the numbers that came out of that winter humiliated every builder in the valley." By the time the cold broke in early February, the difference was undeniable. Jack Torrance started asking questions. So did others. They wanted to know exactly how much firewood Elias had burned, how warm his cabin stayed, how long the heat lasted after the fire died. Elias didn't keep scientific records, but he knew his consumption. He'd started the winter with 4 cords of split pine stacked outside his cabin. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of firewood. By the end of January, he'd burned through 1.5 cords. Jack Torrance, in the same period, had burned 6 cords, and his cabin was still cold. That's a 4-to-1 ratio. For every log Elias burned, Jack burned 4. The temperature difference was even more dramatic. On the coldest night, January 18th, when the outside temperature hit minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit, Jack's cabin held at 42 degrees Fahrenheit with the fire roaring constantly. Elias's cabin, with a moderate fire burning lazily in the hearth, stayed at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, a 24-degree difference. But the most impressive number was this: heat retention after the fire died. In a conventional cabin, once the fire burns out, the temperature drops fast. Within 2 hours, Jack's cabin would fall below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, it was near freezing inside. Elias's cabin was different. He let his fire burn down to coals before bed. By midnight, the coals were mostly ash. No flames, minimal heat output. And yet, when he woke at dawn, 6 hours later, the inside temperature was still 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 58 degrees. 6 hours after the fire died. In minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit weather. The wool had done what Elias thought it would. It trapped heat. The thick layer of compressed fleece acted like a thermal battery, absorbing radiant warmth from the hearth and releasing it slowly into the air. The lanolin-coated fibers resisted moisture, staying dry even as condensation formed elsewhere. The air pockets in the wool slowed conduction, preventing the cold from creeping in through the log walls. Jack stood in Elias's cabin on a bitter afternoon in late January, feeling the warmth, looking at the wool-padded walls, and said what everyone was thinking. "We were wrong." Elias nodded. "Happens." Jack ran his hand along the interior wall, feeling the texture of the boards that hid the fleece behind them. "How much wool did you use?" "About 700 pounds. Maybe a little more." "Where'd you get it?" "Shearing shed. Stuff the buyers didn't want." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that would change the valley. "Could you help me do the same thing?" Elias smiled. "Yeah, I could do that." Within 2 weeks, Jack Torrance had pulled the interior boards off his cabin walls and started packing wool into the gaps. He used fleece from his own sheep, stuff he would have burned or composted. It took him 4 days to insulate one wall. By mid-February, he'd finished all 4. The difference was immediate. His firewood consumption dropped by half. The inside temperature rose by 15 degrees. His children stopped wearing coats indoors. Word spread. By March, 11 families in the valley had started wool insulation projects. Some used raw fleece like Elias. Others used washed wool, felted wool, or even wool scraps from old blankets and clothing. The method varied, but the principle was the same: trap air, block wind, hold heat. By the following winter, 1937 to 1938, 23 cabins within 50 miles had wool-lined walls. Raymond Hess, the carpenter who'd mocked the idea, visited Elias in the spring. He didn't apologize outright, but he asked detailed questions. How thick should the wool be? How do you prevent settling? What about rodents? Elias answered each one. Hess left, nodded once, and said, "Good work." It was as close to an admission as Elias would get. The technique didn't become famous. It didn't get written up in journals or taught in schools. But in that part of Montana, in those high valleys where winter was a test of will and preparation, wool insulation became common knowledge. Not because someone marketed it, not because an expert endorsed it, because it worked. And in that country, That was all that mattered. Spring arrived late in 1937. Snow lingered in the valleys until mid-April. Ice on the rivers didn't break until May. But when the thaw finally came, something else had changed in those Montana highlands. Something quieter than the season, but just as permanent. The wool insulation technique had taken root. Not through advertising, not through mandates or building codes. It spread the way good ideas always spread in hard country. Person to person, neighbor to neighbor, one conversation at a time. Jack Torrance had been the first to follow Elias's lead. His success convinced others. By summer, families across the valley were collecting wool after shearing season. Wool they'd once discarded or sold for pennies. They packed it into walls under floors above ceilings. Some used raw fleece straight from the sheep. Others washed it first to remove dirt and lanolin, though many soon learned that the unwashed wool worked better. The natural oils helped repel moisture. The methods varied. Some builders created the same cavity wall system Elias had used, with 6 inches of compressed wool between an inner and outer wall. Others stuffed wool directly into the chinking gaps, sealing cracks without adding interior framing. A few families felted the wool first, wetting it, compressing it into dense mats, and nailed those mats to the inside walls like insulation panels. All of them worked. By the winter of 1937 to 1938, 23 cabins in the region had some form of wool insulation. The number kept growing. Families who'd struggled through the brutal winter of 37 weren't willing to risk another freezing season. Wool was free, or nearly free. It didn't require special tools or skills, and it delivered results that were impossible to ignore. The community didn't celebrate Elias. They didn't throw him a parade or name a technique after him. That wasn't the way of things in that part of the world. But they respected him differently now. When he came to town, people asked his advice. When a new family moved into the valley, someone would mention the shepherd who'd insulated with wool, and they'd go visit him to learn how. Elias didn't charge for his help. He'd walk over to a neighbor's place, look at their cabin, explain what he'd done, and help them get started. Sometimes he'd bring a bag of wool from his own shed to get them going. He saw it as simple practicality. If more cabins stayed warm, fewer people suffered, and the whole valley became more resilient. Raymond Hess, the carpenter who'd once mocked the idea, started recommending wool insulation to his clients by 1938. He didn't call it Elias's method. He just called it wool layering and presented it as a proven winterization technique. He charged for the labor, of course, but he gave Elias credit when asked where he'd learned it. By 1940, wool insulation had become part of the local building culture. It wasn't universal. Some folks still preferred traditional chinking, and others couldn't get enough wool to make it worthwhile, but it was common enough that newcomers to the area would hear about it within their first winter. The technique stayed regional. It never spread beyond the Montana highlands and a few neighboring valleys in Idaho and Wyoming. In part, that's because it required access to sheep and raw wool, which wasn't available everywhere. In part, it's because the technique was oral, passed from person to person, not written down in manuals or taught in schools. But in the places where it took hold, it became foundational knowledge. The kind of thing grandparents taught grandchildren. The kind of thing you learn not from books, but from watching someone do it and then doing it yourself. Elias Morrow lived another 14 years after that winter. He died in 1951, at 79, in the same wool-lined cabin he'd built in 1936. When his neighbors found him, the fire had burned down to ash, but the cabin was still warm. His property was sold to a young couple from Great Falls. They kept the cabin as it was, wool-lined walls and all. They lived there for 30 years. The wool never rotted. It never attracted rodents, as the critics had predicted. It just kept doing what Elias had known it would do: trap air, block wind, and hold heat. When they finally tore the cabin down in the 1980s to build a larger house, they pulled the old boards off the walls and found the wool still intact. Compressed, dusty, faded to gray, but structurally sound. Still insulating after 44 years. They saved some of it as a curiosity. The rest they composted. Today, the technique is mostly forgotten. Modern insulation, fiberglass, foam, cellulose, has replaced the old methods. But in a few remote valleys, in cabins built by people who learned from Elias Morrow, you can still find wool in the walls. Not because it's trendy, because it works. Elias Morrow wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a scientist. He was a shepherd who had a problem and used what he had to solve it. The lesson isn't about wool, specifically. It's about observation, about knowing your materials, about trusting practical results over accepted norms. The experts said wool would rot, attract pests, and fail. They were wrong because they were operating on assumptions, not experience. Elias operated on what he'd seen. Sheep don't freeze. Wool keeps them alive. Maybe it could keep him alive, too. He didn't prove them wrong with arguments. He proved them wrong by surviving. And that's the mark of real knowledge. Not what sounds right in theory, but what works when your life depends on it. Traditional methods aren't primitive. They're proven. They've been tested by necessity, refined by generations, and passed down because they delivered results. The fact that we've forgotten them doesn't mean they stopped working. It just means we stopped paying attention. Elias's wool-lined cabin saved him in the harshest winter in 65 years. But more than that, it reminded an entire community that the old ways weren't backward. They were smart, efficient, and worth remembering. Maybe there's a technique like that in your own history. Something your grandparents knew. Something simple, almost obvious, that we've replaced with something more expensive and less effective. If there is, it's worth learning. Because when the cold comes, and it always comes, you want solutions that work, not solutions that sound good. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. I want to hear your stories. And if you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I bring you another survival technique that actually worked when lives were on the line. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. Educational note. This script is for historical and educational purposes. Wool insulation, as described here, reflects period-appropriate frontier building techniques. Modern building codes, fire safety regulations, moisture barriers, and ventilation standards should always be followed when constructing or retrofitting any dwelling. Consult licensed professionals before attempting any insulation project.